Have you ever noticed the more you share your problems, the lighter you feel? Yet strangely, the weaker you start to look. The truth is, not everyone who listens to your struggles wants to see you win. Some people use your problems as entertainment, some use them as ammunition, and very few actually care enough to help. So today, I want to tell you why the smartest move you can make is to stop handing people the keys to your struggles and start guarding your peace instead. You know, the truth is, not everyone deserves access to your struggles. And that's a hard pill to swallow because when life hits us, when pressure builds up, our first instinct is to talk about it. We want someone to know how much we're hurting, how unfair things feel, how heavy the load is. And that's normal. We're human. But here's the catch. Not everybody listening actually cares. Some people listen just enough to nod, but inside, they're not storing your pain as empathy. They're storing it as information. Information about where you're weak, where you're vulnerable, and where they can measure themselves against you. Think about it. The moment you start telling someone all your problems, you've just given them a roadmap to your insecurities. And not everybody is kind enough to hold that carefully. Some will handle it recklessly, and some will use it against you. They'll keep it in the back of their mind, and the next time there's tension or competition, that very problem you once trusted them with becomes their weapon. That's why wisdom says, protect your problems the way you'd protect your passwords. You don't just hand those out to anyone who asks, and it's not always malicious. Sometimes it's careless. People don't always mean to betray you, but they do. You vent to a coworker, and suddenly the whole office knows. You share your struggles with a family member, and by next weekend, everyone's giving you advice on a problem you never wanted public. See, once your words leave your mouth, you lose control of them. And the one thing you can't afford to lose control of is your peace. Let me tell you something that's true in every circle, every workplace, every family. The fewer people who know your problems, the safer your peace of mind is. The more private you keep your struggles, the more power you hold. Because power isn't about how much you say, it's about how much you can keep to yourself. Silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. People sometimes confuse being open with being strong. They think vulnerability means sharing everything with everyone. But strength isn't measured by how loud your problems are. It's measured by how quietly you can carry them without losing yourself. You don't need everyone to see your wounds to prove you're human. You don't need an audience for your pain. What you need is discernment, the wisdom to know who's for me, who's against me, and who simply doesn't need to know anything at all. The world is full of listeners, but very few of them are true supporters. Some people smile in your face, then turn your problems into stories. Some people pat your back, then secretly feel better about themselves because at least they're not in your situation. And others, they don't care enough to help. They only care enough to know. And once you understand that, you'll start protecting yourself differently. You'll start realizing, I don't have to tell everyone what I'm going through. Because the truth is, sometimes the best response is no response. Sometimes the strongest move is to keep it to yourself, deal with it privately, and only share when you've already overcome it. That way, people don't see your weakness. They see your strength. They don't see the storm you survived. They see the strength it took to walk out of it. So no, not everyone deserves access to your struggles. Because the wrong person will drain you, but the right person will help you. And the difference between the two is knowing who you can trust and who you should stay silent around. Here's something most people don't realize. When you share your problems with the wrong people, you're not inviting solutions, you're inviting opinions. And opinions don't heal. Opinions don't fix. Opinions just weigh you down more than the problem itself. Because think about it. How many times have you opened up to someone expecting understanding, but instead you walked away feeling judged? You expected relief, but instead you felt smaller, weaker, almost like you'd given away a piece of your dignity. That's the danger of oversharing. It doesn't always bring help. Sometimes it brings more damage. See, people love to give advice, but not all advice is born out of wisdom. A lot of advice comes from pride. Some people aren't trying to help you. They're trying to feel smarter than you. They'll listen to your problem, and instead of compassion, they'll hand you a lecture. They'll make you feel like you should have already known better, like your struggle is your fault. And suddenly, you went to them for relief, but now you're walking away carrying their judgment on top of your burden. And here's what's even trickier. Some people don't give you advice for your sake. They give it for control. The more you depend on their answers, the more powerful they feel. They don't want you to figure it out on your own, because if you did, they'd lose their sense of importance in your life. So what looks like support is actually a way of keeping you tied to them, always coming back, always leaning, never standing fully on your own. And if you're not careful, you end up mistaking manipulation for mentorship. Another problem with oversharing is this: it multiplies the voices in your head. You tell 5 different people about the same issue, and now you've got 5 different perspectives competing with your own. Instead of clarity, you're left with confusion. Instead of focusing on solutions, you're buried under noise. And the more noise you let in, the harder it is to hear your own wisdom, your own instincts, that inner voice that often knows the way forward before anyone else does. Sometimes the people you talk to don't even mean harm, but they still make things worse. They project their own fears, their own regrets, their own limitations onto you. You tell them your dream, and they'll remind you of all the reasons it's risky. You tell them your struggle, and they'll make it sound bigger than it is. Not because they hate you, but because that's how they see the world. And if you're not careful, you'll start seeing it their way too. That's why it's so important to be selective. Not silent forever, but strategic, because not every ear deserves your honesty. Not every voice deserves the chance to shape your next move. Oversharing is like leaving your door wide open. You don't just let in the people who care, you let in anybody who happens to be passing by. And once they're in, they don't always leave quietly. At the end of the day, your problems need less talking and more solving. And solving doesn't come from scattering your pain across 100 conversations. It comes from guarding your energy, narrowing your circle, and remembering that the loudest voices aren't always the wisest ones. So don't confuse sharing with healing. Healing doesn't happen in judgment. Healing doesn't happen in gossip. Healing happens when you stop giving everyone a say in your life and start choosing carefully who actually gets the privilege of knowing your struggle. One of the hardest lessons you'll ever learn is that your problems don't always stay where you left them. You can share something in confidence, believing it will remain between you and that person, but the moment it leaves your lips, it has legs of its own. And problems in the wrong hands, they don't stay as problems. They turn into stories. They turn into gossip. And before long, they're not even your words anymore. They're somebody else's version of your life, traveling further than you ever imagined. See, people don't always spread your problems because they hate you. Sometimes they do it because it's entertaining. Your struggle becomes the headline in their conversation with someone else. They tell it with drama, with detail, with just enough twist to make the story juicy. And before long, your private pain is being passed around as casual conversation. What started as your truth becomes someone else's amusement. That's the risk you take when you hand your struggles to people who don't value privacy. And here's the reality. People love stories. They may not repeat your successes, they may not brag about your strengths, but the moment you give them a problem, suddenly it's worth repeating. Why? Because problems are easier to digest than victories. Struggles make people feel less alone, sometimes even superior, and gossip has a way of traveling faster than anything good ever will. What makes it worse is this: once people start repeating your struggles, you lose control of the narrative. You no longer get to decide how it's told. You don't get to decide what details are emphasized or what context is left out. Suddenly your life is in someone else's hands, shaped by their perspective, their tone, their exaggeration. And when it circles back to you, it doesn't even sound like your story anymore. It's distorted, colored, and twisted by people who were never supposed to have it in the first place. That's why being careful with your words matters. Because every time you share a problem with the wrong person, you're not just letting them into your life, you're letting their entire circle into your life too. And here's the truth, once it's out there, you can't pull it back. You can't unring that bell. The only way to guarantee your problems don't end up as gossip is to keep them with you or to share them only with someone who's earned the right to hear them. And I want you to really think about this. How many times has gossip destroyed trust, ruined relationships, or made you question people you thought were close to you? Most of the time, it didn't start with a lie. It started with truth. A piece of truth that was handed to someone who wasn't responsible enough to carry it. That's all it takes. And it spreads, not because the problem was too big, but because the wrong person couldn't keep it small. So when I say keep your problems private, it's not about shutting everyone out. It's about protecting yourself from becoming the center of conversations you never asked to be in. It's about guarding your dignity and making sure your struggles don't become entertainment. Because here's the reality, the less people know about your problems, the less they have to say about you. And when they have less to say, you hold more power. The truth is, your problems don't define you. But when you start sharing them with everybody, that's exactly what happens. People stop seeing the whole picture of who you are, and they start reducing you down to the struggles you've spoken the loudest about. You might have 10 strengths, 10 victories, 10 qualities that set you apart, but the moment you make your problems your headline, that becomes the label people attach to you. And over time, you don't just become the person who has struggles, you become the person who is the struggle. That's the danger of telling everyone what you're going through. It's not that problems themselves make you weak. It's that people begin to identify you by them. You become the one who's always stressed, the one who's always broke, the one who's always unlucky in relationships. And the more you repeat those stories, the deeper that identity sticks. Even if you move past the problem, people's memory of you often lingers where your words left them. And let's be real, once people see you through the lens of your problems, it's hard to change their perspective. Even when you grow, even when you improve, they'll still hold on to that old image. Why? Because you taught them who you were by what you kept repeating. You gave them the soundtrack, and they just keep replaying it. That's why guarding your words matters so much. Because every time you talk about a struggle, you're not just venting. You're painting a picture of yourself in someone else's mind. Now, does that mean you should never share anything? Of course not. But it does mean you need to be intentional. There's a difference between sharing a problem with someone who can truly help you versus broadcasting it to people who can only label you by it. One adds value, the other takes it away. And the more you choose the wrong audience, the more you risk being remembered for your hardships instead of your strengths. It's also worth thinking about the energy you create when you constantly speak your problems out loud. The more you tell the story of your struggle, the more you start believing that's who you are. Words have weight. And when you keep repeating your pain, it reinforces the idea that your pain is permanent. That's how people get stuck. They don't just go through problems, they start living inside them. They turn a season into an identity. But you're not your failures. You're not your heartbreaks. You're not your mistakes. Those are things you went through, not definitions of who you are. The problem is, when you make them your story to everyone, people won't separate the two. They won't see that you had a problem. They'll see that you are the problem. And if you don't protect yourself from that, you end up carrying the weight of other people's perception, not just your actual situation. The strongest people aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who refuse to be defined by the struggle. They face it, they work through it, and when they talk about it, it's only after they've overcome it. So their story inspires instead of labels. That's the difference. If you want people to remember your strength, don't make your problems your introduction. Make your growth your introduction. Make your resilience the story they know you for. Because at the end of the day, you don't get to control what problems life gives you, but you do get to control what identity people attach to your name. And that choice is made every time you decide whether to share your problems or to protect them until they've already been turned into victories. There's something powerful about silence. People often confuse it with weakness, like if you're not talking about every hardship, every frustration, you must not be strong enough to face it. But the truth is the opposite. Complaining is easy. Silence takes strength. Anybody can open their mouth and unload their pain on the world. That doesn't cost anything, but it takes real discipline to carry your struggles with composure, to sit with your pain without needing an audience for it, to stand tall even when you feel like collapsing inside. And here's what happens when you live that way. People respect you more. Think about it. We've all been around someone who complains nonstop. They talk about what's wrong with their job, their family, their money, their health. Every conversation circles back to their problems. And what happens over time? You stop seeing them as strong, you start seeing them as heavy. Being around them drains you because all they've shown you is their weakness, never their resilience. That's what complaining does. It drains the listener, and it lowers the speaker. But now picture the opposite. Picture someone you know who doesn't broadcast every hardship. They move through life with calmness. You can tell they're carrying something because everyone's carrying something, but they don't feel the need to announce it. They just keep showing up, keep working, keep holding their head high. That person doesn't lose respect. They gain it. Because strength is quiet. Real strength doesn't need to prove itself with words. It proves itself with presence. Silence doesn't mean you're ignoring your pain. It doesn't mean you're pretending it doesn't exist. It means you're choosing not to make your pain your brand. You're choosing to let your actions speak louder than your complaints. And in doing so, you shift the way people see you. Instead of being the one who always needs help, you become the one others look to for inspiration. Here's something you should remember. The world is always watching. Even when you think nobody notices, they do. And when people see that you don't crumble under pressure, when they see that you carry your struggles with grace, they respect you more. They may never say it out loud, but they admire it. Because deep down, everyone knows silence requires control. Complaining is emotional release, but silence is emotional mastery, and mastery always commands respect. Now, I'm not saying you should never open up. There are moments to share, moments to ask for help, moments to let someone you trust step into your struggles with you. But the problem comes when you make complaining your habit, when every situation, every setback, becomes another story you feel you have to tell. That's when you drain the respect out of yourself. That's when people stop listening, not because they don't hear you, but because they've already labeled you as someone who can't handle life without constant sympathy. And here's the part nobody tells you. When you complain too much, people stop taking your pain seriously. They hear you so often that your problems become background noise. What used to sound urgent now just sounds repetitive. You lose credibility, not because your problems aren't real, but because your response to them has become predictable. That's what silence protects you from. Silence keeps your credibility intact. It makes people pay attention when you finally do speak, because they know if you're saying something, it matters. So yes, silence builds respect, and complaints drain it. You don't earn respect by talking about every storm you're in. You earn it by walking through the storm with enough strength that people can see it, without you saying a word. Every time you hand your problems to the wrong person, what you're really doing is delaying progress. Because the truth is, most people can't fix what you're going through. They don't have the power, the tools, or even the perspective to solve it for you. So what ends up happening? You share your problem, they give you a reaction, maybe a little sympathy, maybe a quick piece of advice, and for a moment you feel lighter. But that feeling fades because nothing has actually changed. You just traded action for conversation. And that's why so many people stay stuck. They spend more time talking about their problems than they do solving them. They want comfort more than clarity. They want sympathy more than strategy. But here's the reality: sympathy might make you feel understood, but solutions are what move you forward. And the longer you sit in circles of sympathy, the longer you delay the growth that only comes from actually doing the work. You have to ask yourself, what do I really want? Comfort or change? Because they don't usually come together. Comfort makes you feel safe, but change makes you stronger. Comfort keeps you talking, but change pushes you into action. And the people who keep running back to comfort never reach the other side of their struggle because they've trained themselves to need an audience instead of a breakthrough. Sometimes we confuse venting with healing, but venting is just releasing pressure. It doesn't fix the leak. Healing takes more than words. It takes decisions. It takes discipline. It takes the courage to sit with your pain long enough to find the solution instead of rushing to someone else to carry it for you. That's how growth happens. Not in the telling, but in the doing. And here's something important to realize: solutions don't live in gossip circles. They don't live in complaint sessions. They don't come from telling everyone how unfair life feels. Solutions live in discipline, in silence. In those moments, when you stop talking about the problem long enough to start working on it, that's where breakthroughs are born, not in conversations that go nowhere, but in actions that move you forward. When you start shifting from sympathy, seeking to solution seeking, everything about you changes. Your posture changes. Your presence changes. People stop seeing you as someone who's always in need, and they start seeing you as someone who takes ownership. And ownership commands respect in a way complaints never will, because respect doesn't come from how loudly you share your struggles. It comes from how clearly you show your strength. There's also freedom in it. Because the more you rely on sympathy, the more you stay tied to other people's responses. If they listen, you feel better. If they don't, you feel worse. Your peace becomes dependent on someone else's reaction. But when you decide to focus on solutions, you take that power back. You're no longer waiting for someone else to validate your pain. You're turning your pain into progress on your own terms. And that's where real strength lies. So, the next time you feel the urge to share your problems with everyone, stop and ask yourself, am I looking for sympathy or am I looking for a solution? Because one will keep you talking, but the other will keep you growing.